The Dark Truth About Dwayne Johnson's 1996 WWE debut is a documented history of severe physical hazing and corporate complicity. Resenting his rapid executive promotion, veteran wrestlers subjected the 24-year-old to systematic locker room abuse, forcing him to perform degrading tasks and deliberately injuring him during training. WWE management actively ignored the harassment, utilizing it as a calculated corporate test. Combined with extreme audience rejection, the relentless physical and psychological trauma brought Johnson to the absolute brink of resignation in 1997 before he adopted the Rock persona. This is the cold physical reality of corporate wrestling culture. The physical architecture of a human being is dictated by genetics, but their public identity is frequently manufactured by corporate mandates. Dwayne Douglas Johnson was born into a biological dynasty that treated the professional wrestling ring not as a theatrical stage, but as an ancestral proving ground. His genetic blueprint was forged in the lawless, highly volatile, territorial wrestling circuits of the 1970s and 1980s. His maternal grandfather was High Chief Peter Mavia, a legitimate, terrifying enforcer and a recognized cultural icon of Samoa. Bypassing any theatrical character work, his body was authentically adorned with the traditional pia, a grueling full-body tattoo signifying immense cultural status, physical endurance, and a warrior ethos that demanded absolute respect in locker rooms filled with dangerous men. This lineage was physically dominant, fiercely proud, and deeply rooted in the authentic blood-stained history of Polynesian combat. This Polynesian heritage was fused with the groundbreaking legacy of his father, Rocky Johnson. Operating in an era severely restricted by racial segregation and prejudice, Rocky Johnson broke through the Southern wrestling territories, utilizing the physique of a Greek god and the rapid-fire, untouchable charisma of a heavyweight boxing champion. He was a pioneer for black athletes in the industry, surviving and thriving in environments that were openly hostile to his existence. Dwayne Johnson inherited this specific, highly potent genetic cocktail. He was born carrying the physical mass, the explosive fast twitch muscle fiber, and the inherent undeniable magnetism of two distinct powerful minority lineages. When a severe back injury and subsequent failures in the Canadian Football League eradicated his aspirations of professional football, Dwayne retreated to the family trade. He arrived at the corporate headquarters of the World Wrestling Federation in the summer of 1996. He brought with him a towering 6'5", 260-pound frame and the unprecedented pedigree of a third-generation competitor. The corporate boardroom, however, did not view this young man as the heir to a fierce warrior dynasty. The executives sitting in Stamford, Connecticut, evaluated him strictly through the lens of mid-1990s demographic marketing. The WWF in 1996 was in the midst of a severe financial and creative crisis. They were losing a bitter television ratings war to their rival, World Championship Wrestling. The executive mandate from the top of the WWF hierarchy was the desperate acquisition and manufacturing of safe, family-friendly heroes to appeal to a broad, mainstream, predominantly white audience. When the booking committee examined Dwayne Johnson, they immediately initiated a clinical process of corporate filtration. They identified his mixed race heritage and immense physical presence not as assets to be unleashed, but as raw materials that needed to be aggressively sanitized. The systematic erasure of his identity began with his name. The boardroom stripped him of his autonomy, arbitrarily combining his father's and grandfather's ring names to manufacture the trademark Rocky Mavia. The executives viewed his unparalleled lineage strictly as a marketing tool, a convenient promotional hook to sell merchandise to children, entirely failing to comprehend or respect the authentic, gritty source code of the Anoa'i family identity. They programmed him to be the ultimate blue chipper, an industry classification for an overly enthusiastic, flawless, and profoundly sterile athletic prospect. The visual degradation imposed upon him was staggering. The wardrobe department, operating under executive orders, constructed ring gear that directly insulted his physical reality. Instead of honoring the fierce, intimidating aesthetic of his Samoan warrior spirit, the company forced him into a ridiculous turquoise and blue outfit, heavily adorned with flowing theatrical tassels. They styled his hair in a tightly permed, severely outdated cut. The contrast was visually jarring and inherently ridiculous, a colossal, heavily muscled powerhouse of Samoan and black descent, dressed in a pastel costume that resembled a cheap circus act. This visual humiliation was merely the superficial layer of a much deeper psychological suppression. The true violence executed by the corporate machine was the behavioral mandate imposed upon the young athlete. The executives required Rocky Mavia to be unconditionally likable. In the corporate lexicon of that specific era, this required the systematic blunting of any sharp edges. The company actively sought to blur and soften the strong, assertive characteristics of minority wrestlers to ensure they remained entirely non-threatening and easily digestible for the core demographic. The primary weapon utilized to enforce this compliance was the mandated smile. Dwayne was strictly ordered to smile constantly. Completely devoid of organic human joy, the mandated smile functioned explicitly as a corporate gag order. He was forced to grin blindingly wide while walking down the entrance ramp. He was forced to smile while reciting heavily scripted hollow dialogue written by executives who had no understanding of his actual voice. Most damagingly, the boardroom dictated that he must smile even after absorbing legitimate physical beatings, losing high-stakes matches, or being verbally humiliated by veteran performers. This psychological manipulation required him to completely sever his internal emotional reality from his outward physical expression. He was a highly competitive, physically dominant young man operating in a notoriously cutthroat locker room, carrying the immense pressure of his family's legacy on his back. He experienced genuine physical pain, professional frustration, and the inherent humiliation of executing a character he knew was fundamentally broken. Yet, the moment the red light on the television camera illuminated, he was contractually obligated to suppress every ounce of that authentic human aggression and flash an empty, desperate grin. The company completely ignored his internal suppression, prioritizing the sterile corporate image over his psychological well-being. A clinical audit of the exact physical mechanisms utilized by the veteran locker room perfectly exposes the sheer psychological terror of Dwayne Johnson's 1996 induction. The narrative of paying dues frequently romanticizes the brutal reality of professional wrestling hazing. Far from a chaotic, disorganized form of bullying, this mid-1990s locker room process operated as a highly systematic, corporate-sanctioned protocol of physical subjugation known internally as delivering a receipt. When the 24-year-old rookie arrived, bearing the immediate resentment of the veterans for his massive guaranteed contract and unparalleled family lineage, He was perceived as an illegitimate interloper who had bypassed the grueling independent circuit. The veterans, operating with the tacit, unspoken authorization of the executive management team, utilized their matches with the rookie not to teach him the craft, but to physically break him. Within the choreography of a standard match, performers constantly execute working strikes, blows designed to look devastating while transferring minimal kinetic energy to protect the opponent's anatomy. However, when a veteran decided to issue a receipt to Rocky Maivia, the physical boundaries of the performance evaporated. A simulated clothesline was deliberately transformed into a legitimate, unmitigated forearm strike aimed directly at the jawline or the trachea. Complex grappling holds were intentionally applied with excessive joint-shattering torque, forcing the rookie's ligaments to the absolute threshold of tearing. The psychological architecture of this abuse relies entirely on the industry's strict code of omerta, absolute silence. If Johnson broke character and retaliated against the veteran during the live broadcast, he would be immediately terminated for going off script and endangering the television product. If he returned to the backstage area and reported the physical abuse to management, he would be universally labeled as weak and systematically blackballed from the industry. He was trapped in a highly specialized physical prison. He was forced to endure legitimate, bone-jarring concussive trauma from grown men who actively despised him, and he was contractually obligated to return to the locker room afterward and thank them for the match. He had to silently ice his bruises and heavily tape his strained joints, knowing that the billionaire executives monitoring the broadcast were watching the physical hazing and viewing it as a highly effective corporate stress test. They were waiting to see if the smiling, blue-chip prospect would emotionally shatter under the pain, or if he would quietly absorb the unscripted violence to protect his paycheck. The rich, complex cultural traditions of the Polynesian Islands were simultaneously reduced to a shallow, cartoonish caricature. The production truck assigned him generic island-themed entrance music that sounded like a royalty-free track from a tropical resort commercial. The deep, blood-soaked legacy of his grandfather and the cultural significance of his heritage were flattened into a two-dimensional stage play, lacking any genuine cultural depth. The machine had successfully processed him. As 1996 bled into 1997, Dwayne Johnson was trapped inside the neon shell of Rocky Maivia, a minority performer operating within a white corporate structure, forced to aggressively sand down his own identity, wearing a mandated smile as he walked out to face an audience that was rapidly realizing they were being sold a beautifully packaged, entirely empty product. The corporate strategy executed by the Stanford boardroom relied on a fatal miscalculation regarding the evolving psychology of the consumer base. By the spring of 1997, the cultural landscape of the television viewing audience was pivoting violently. The demographic that consumed sports entertainment was actively rejecting the sanitized, cartoonish morality plays of the previous decade. They demanded raw friction, anti-establishment rebellion, and unfiltered authenticity. The introduction of Rocky Maivia was a complete contradiction to this cultural shift. When the young athlete walked down the aisle, flashing his contractually mandated smile and wearing his pastel tassels, the audience did not react with mild apathy. They revolted with a visceral, aggressive hostility. The rejection materialized into a unified, terrifying sonic assault. arenas across North America began to echo with a deafening synchronized chant, "Die, Rocky, die," transcending the standard theatrical heat directed at fictional villains. This manifested as a genuine organic consumer rebellion directed at a product they felt was being forcefully shoved down their throats. The crowd recognized that the entity known as Rocky Mavia was an empty vessel, completely devoid of human reality. Every time he smiled after taking a physical beating, the audience's anger intensified, recognizing the smile as a direct insult to their intelligence. It was a complete public humiliation of a man who was executing the corporate playbook flawlessly. He was doing exactly what his billionaire employer had commanded, and the direct result was 20,000 people screaming for his death on live international television. The psychological devastation of this daily humiliation was catastrophic, but the structural damage extended far beyond Dwayne Johnson's immediate professional standing. The "Die Rocky Die" chants were actively eroding the cultural equity of his bloodline. The Anoa'i dynasty and the legacy of Rocky Johnson were built over decades of legitimate physical sacrifice, earning absolute respect in the most unforgiving environments. Dwayne's corporate mandated buffoonery was rapidly bankrupting that generational equity. He was forced to wear the names of his father and grandfather while being laughed out of professional arenas. The system that promised to elevate him into a global superstar was, in reality, permanently staining the prestigious lineage he was meant to represent. The corporate machine had placed him in a paradox. Continued compliance guaranteed his professional execution, while insubordination risked immediate termination. The breaking point arrived not from a boardroom negotiation, but from a severe biological failure. In April 1997, Dwayne sustained a devastating knee injury that necessitated surgical intervention. He was immediately removed from the active touring schedule and the television broadcasts. This physical breakdown provided a crucial, unexpected advantage: silence. Removed from the daily psychological conditioning of the locker room and the deafening hostility of the arenas, he had the space to forensically evaluate his impending career death. Lying in a rehabilitation facility, the realization crystallized. Returning to the active roster as the smiling blue chipper would be an act of professional suicide. The corporate executives were entirely devoid of alternative creative strategies. Their manufacturing process had failed. Dwayne recognized that if his career in the industry was going to end, he would orchestrate the final act on his own terms, utilizing his authentic genetic and cultural blueprint. When his physical rehabilitation concluded in August 1997, he initiated a highly calculated strike against his own corporate identity. He negotiated his return with a singular, non-negotiable demand. He required a live microphone, and he required 2 minutes of unscripted television time. Entirely discarding the turquoise tassels and mandated smile, he walked into the arena and immediately aligned himself with the nation of domination. This was a radical, highly strategic maneuver. The Nation of Domination was a militant, predominantly black faction within the company, heavily stylized after black nationalist movements. The group was built entirely on themes of racial grievance, anti-establishment rhetoric, and unapologetic aggression. By inserting himself into this specific militant architecture, Dwayne intentionally generated the exact cultural friction the corporate office had previously attempted to erase. The racial and cultural identity that the boardroom had aggressively whitewashed was suddenly weaponized. Taking the microphone, He executed a clinical dismantling of his former corporate self. He officially discarded the name Rocky Maivia. He severed the branding tie that the company had used to sanitize his lineage. He began referring to himself exclusively in the third person. He became The Rock. Elevating beyond a mere theatrical quirk, the utilization of the third person operated strictly as a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism. By separating Dwayne Johnson, the vulnerable 25-year-old rookie who had been emotionally battered and publicly humiliated by the audience, from The Rock, an invincible, untouchable, hyper-confident avatar, he constructed an impenetrable psychological shield. The Rock could not be hurt by the crowd's rejection because The Rock did not require their validation. He immediately turned his verbal crosshairs onto the audience. He explicitly addressed the "Die Rocky Die" chants that had haunted him months prior. Rejecting any plea for forgiveness or affection, he actively and aggressively insulted the audience. He weaponized their previous hatred, matching their hostility with a cold rhythmic cadence, dripping with venom and absolute arrogance. The smile was entirely gone, replaced by a signature piercing glare and a sharply raised eyebrow that projected complete superiority. This arrogance was the armor he required to survive the hostile environment. He utilized his highly educated vocabulary and razor-sharp promotional skills to verbally eviscerate anyone who stepped in his path, including the audience, the interviewers, and the veteran performers who had previously looked down upon him. He embraced the edge of his Samoan and Black heritage, moving with the distinct swagger of an apex predator who had fully recognized his own biological and intellectual superiority. He stopped trying to be likable and focused entirely on being undeniable. The corporate mask was permanently shattered. The machine had attempted to manufacture a puppet, but the extreme psychological pressure of the audience backlash had instead forged a completely autonomous, highly lethal cultural force. The Rock did not recite corporate-approved scripts. He dictated his own narrative in real time, completely shifting the power dynamic between the independent contractor and the boardroom. He had reclaimed his identity, transforming his generational trauma and public humiliation into the foundation of an unstoppable revolutionary persona that the corporate executives could no longer control, but were desperately forced to monetize. The corporate executives who had initially mandated the turquoise tassels and the plastic smile were forced into a profound operational surrender. By the dawn of the new millennium, the entity known as The Rock had completely overwhelmed the structural confines of the World Wrestling Federation. The boardroom did not elevate him to the pinnacle of the industry. He seized it through sheer, unadulterated cultural force. He established a paradigm where the independent contractor dictated the economic trajectory of the entire global monopoly. The financial metrics were unprecedented. The arenas were entirely sold out, not based on the traditional promotion of athletic conflict, but entirely driven by the anticipation of a man holding a live microphone. His linguistic dominance was absolute. He was not merely cutting promotional interviews. He was actively restructuring the daily lexicon of the American public. When a professional wrestler forces a major publishing institution like Merriam-Webster to officially induct a fabricated corporate catchphrase, "Smackdown," into the English dictionary, the boundary between sports entertainment and mainstream cultural architecture has been permanently eradicated. The audience that had viciously chanted for his demise in 1997 was now entirely subjugated. He orchestrated their reactions with the precision of a maestro, pausing for dramatic effect while millions of people across the globe simultaneously recited his phrases. The psychological victory was absolute. He had weaponized his authentic identity to force the masses into total compliance, completely discarding the illusion of his untouchable superstardom. Reveals the sheer exhausting magnitude of Dwayne Johnson's reality during the late 1990s. When the audience finally submitted to the cultural force of The Rock in 1998, the locker room hazing and the receipts administered by jealous veterans abruptly ceased. However, this primitive physical bullying was instantly replaced by a vastly more sophisticated and infinitely more destructive form of abuse: absolute, systemic corporate extraction. As the decade drew to a close, the World Wrestling Federation was preparing for the most critical financial maneuver in its history, an initial public offering, IPO. The billionaire executives in Stanford intended to transition the privately held monopoly into a publicly traded empire on the New York Stock Exchange. To convince Wall Street investment bankers and institutional shareholders of their limitless profitability, the corporation required flawless, indestructible quarterly earnings. Simultaneously, their primary financial engine, Steve Austin, was suffering from severe, rapidly accelerating spinal degradation, rendering his long-term physical viability highly uncertain. Faced with this multi-million-dollar vulnerability, the executive board executed a cold, pragmatic biological transfer. They took the entire crushing financial architecture of the impending IPO and dropped it directly onto the 26-year-old spine of Dwayne Johnson. The corporate mandate transitioned Johnson from a rising star into an industrial workhorse. The operational schedule dictated by management completely defied the fundamental laws of human biomechanics and biological recovery. He was contractually mandated to perform in grueling, high-impact athletic contests upwards of 250 nights a year. There was no off-season. There were no designated periods for tissue repair or neurological rest. He was forced into a relentless nocturnal cycle, absorbing massive kinetic trauma on the wooden canvas, hastily icing severely inflamed joints in locker rooms, and driving rental cars hundreds of miles down unlit highways at 3 a.m. to reach the next corporate staging ground. Furthermore, this extreme physical exhaustion was heavily compounded by the specific, highly dangerous aesthetic requirements of the Attitude Era. To maintain the dominant television ratings required to inflate the corporate stock price, the executives demanded unprecedented levels of on-screen violence. Johnson was frequently required to participate in hardcore choreography. He was violently thrown through standardized wooden tables, dropped onto unyielding concrete arena floors, and forced to endure the unprotected impact of steel chairs against his skull and spinal column. The medical infrastructure of the corporation during this era was notoriously inadequate, functioning more as a triage unit designed to inject painkillers and tape joints to keep the assets moving, rather than prioritizing long-term physiological health. Johnson was operating in a state of perpetual agonizing microtrauma. His body was actively cannibalizing its own cartilage and muscle tissue simply to survive the weekly television tapings. He was swallowing extreme physical pain, night after night, perfectly executing his rapid-fire, charismatic dialogue while his central nervous system screamed for relief. The ultimate terrifying paradox of this era was the severe economic asymmetry of his sacrifice. Every drop of blood he shed on the canvas, every concussive impact he absorbed, and every sold-out stadium he commanded actively drove the corporate valuation of the WWF into the stratosphere. When the company officially went public in October 1999, the McMahon family instantly generated hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid capital. They became undisputed titans of Wall Street. Yet Johnson, the primary biological engine driving this historic wealth generation, remained legally classified as an independent contractor. He received his merchandise royalties and his negotiated downside guarantees, but he possessed absolutely zero equity in the empire he was physically breaking himself to build. Even more devastatingly, he did not legally own the name The Rock that he had personally forged in the fires of audience rejection. The corporation held the exclusive trademark. He was experiencing a profound clinical realization of his own mortality and financial captivity. He mathematically calculated that the wrestling ring was a biological death sentence. If he remained tethered to the corporate touring schedule, the machine would inevitably consume his knees, his lumbar spine, and his cerebral cortex before he reached his 35th birthday, leaving him entirely discarded and legally dispossessed of his own identity. It was this specific, terrifying clarity, the realization that his physical destruction was merely subsidizing the billionaire status of his employers, that initiated his desperate, highly calculated extraction strategy. He did not look toward Hollywood merely to fulfill an artistic ambition. He recognized that the silver screen was his only available escape hatch before the wrestling monopoly completely ground his skeletal structure into dust. This level of unprecedented cultural heat immediately triggered the algorithms of a much larger, far more lucrative corporate syndicate, the Hollywood studio system. The wrestling industry, despite its massive cash flow, is structurally designed as a closed, finite loop. A performer's biological prime is systematically ground down to generate television ratings, culminating inevitably in physical breakdown and financial obsolescence. Dwayne Johnson recognized that true, untouchable autonomy could only be achieved by utilizing the wrestling platform as a temporary financial lever to breach the gates of mainstream cinema. The critical breach occurred in March 2000 during his debut as the host of Saturday Night Live. Bypassing the parameters of a standard promotional crossover, this appearance functioned as a highly calculated, heavily scrutinized audition executed live in front of the most powerful casting directors and studio executives in Los Angeles. The entertainment elite expected a hulking, linguistically limited brute stumbling through cue cards. Instead, Johnson delivered a masterclass in comedic timing, live television adaptability, and effortless charisma. He systematically dismantled the deeply entrenched Hollywood prejudice against professional wrestlers. He proved he could command a mainstream non-wrestling demographic without relying on physical violence. The response from the studio system was an immediate, aggressive acquisition strategy. He bypassed the traditional, grueling Hollywood audition circuit entirely. For his debut leading role in The Scorpion King, the executives at Universal Pictures authorized a base salary of $5.5 million, a Guinness World Record for a first-time leading man. They authorized this unprecedented expenditure because they recognized the exact metric the wrestling boardroom had initially failed to see. Dwayne Johnson possessed an organic, highly monetizable gravitational pull. Completely bypassing the need for executive permission, He utilized his massive leverage to forcefully dictate his filming schedules to the wrestling company. The power dynamic had permanently inverted. He was no longer a disposable asset housed within the wrestling machine. The wrestling machine had been reduced to a mere stepping stone in the expansion of his personal empire. However, the transition into the Hollywood ecosystem exposed him to a new, highly sophisticated iteration of corporate filtration. The trauma of 1996 was about to repeat itself in the boardrooms of Los Angeles. In the mid-2000s, the Hollywood agency representation, specifically at Creative Artists Agency, CAA, operated under a rigid, standardized aesthetic template for leading men. The industry was dominated by lean, brooding figures like George Clooney and Brad Pitt. A 260-pound, heavily tattooed Samoan black man with massive muscular hypertrophy did not fit the established algorithmic spreadsheet for romantic comedies or dramatic leads. The corporate handlers issued a new set of mandates. They instructed Johnson to drastically reduce his muscle mass. They ordered him to stop referring to himself as The Rock, attempting to sever his connection to his fiercely loyal wrestling fan base. They pushed him into highly sanitized, universally inoffensive family comedies like The Tooth Fairy and The Game Plan. He was instructed to wear prosthetic wings and tutus. The psychological parallel is devastating. A decade after the wrestling executives forced him into pastel tassels and ordered him to smile to appease a family demographic, the Hollywood executives were systematically starving his biological reality and stripping his cultural identity to fit their specific metric of a safe leading man. He was, once again, acquiescing to a corporate machine that demanded the suppression of his authentic physical and psychological presence. He was losing weight, losing his edge, and rapidly losing his box office viability. The corporate attempt to mold him into a conventional actor was a catastrophic failure, driving his career toward quiet obscurity. In 2011, the breaking point was reached for the second time in his life. The realization crystallized that relying on traditional corporate structures, whether in Stanford or Hollywood, would always result in the systematic erasure of his identity. He executed a ruthless, absolute purge of his professional ecosystem. He fired his powerful Hollywood agents. He partnered with his ex-wife and elite financial strategist, Danny Garcia, to form Seven Bucks Productions. He ceased starving his body to fit into Hollywood-tailored suits. He returned to the weight room, actively cultivating a massive, hyper-masculine, undeniable physical presence. He reclaimed the moniker The Rock. This was the birth of his absolute control era. He did not just want to star in movies. He demanded ownership of the production apparatus. He returned to the WWE for a highly publicized multi-year program with John Cena, not because he possessed a nostalgic desire to take concussive bumps on a wooden canvas, but because he needed to extract the global television bandwidth of the WWE to aggressively market his Hollywood reemergence. He utilized the wrestling monopoly as a free international promotional vehicle for the Fast and Furious and G.I. Joe franchises. He had learned the ultimate lesson of the corporate meat grinder. You either own the machine, or the machine grinds you into dust. As his box office supremacy exploded throughout the 2010s, transforming him into the highest paid actor on the planet. The psychological scars of his early powerlessness manifested in an obsessive, almost tyrannical need for contractual control. The man who was once forced to lie on his back and lose matches on the arbitrary orders of Vince McMahon developed a highly defensive, legally binding shield to ensure he could never be visually or physically dominated again. This psychological defense mechanism became highly visible during his tenure in the Fast and Furious franchise, specifically during his highly publicized feud with co-star Vin Diesel. Investigative reports leaked the existence of equal pain clauses within Johnson's contracts. He employed legal teams to mathematically ensure that his character could not be seen taking more physical damage than his co-stars. The choreography of every fight scene was heavily scrutinized. He contractually legislated his own invincibility. He refused to allow any director, producer, or rival actor to execute a narrative where he definitively lost a physical altercation. In the wrestling ring, a performer's physical dignity is entirely at the mercy of the booker. In Hollywood, Johnson utilized his massive leverage to eradicate that vulnerability. He transformed his trauma response into binding corporate law. The apex of this corporate hubris and the darkest manifestation of his need for absolute control occurred during the production and release of the superhero film Black Adam in 2022. He did not merely want to portray a comic book character. He attempted to execute a hostile, unilateral takeover of the DC Extended Universe. He routinely bypassed the established hierarchy of DC Films executives, utilizing his massive social media following and independent financing partners to pitch strategies directly to the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, David Zaslav. He attempted to center a multi-billion-dollar cinematic universe entirely around himself and his hand-picked management team. When the film severely underperformed at the global box office, the carefully curated, highly polished public facade of the tequila-selling, universally beloved nice guy violently fractured. The Hollywood trade publications were flooded with anonymous leaks from executives detailing a ruthless, highly calculating businessman who was willing to cannibalize a historic comic book brand, alienate studio heads, and manipulate box office accounting to serve his own ego and protect his brand equity. The public was given a sudden, stark glimpse behind the curtain. The smile was still there, but it was now clearly visible as a highly calculated corporate instrument masking an incredibly aggressive, uncompromising boardroom apex predator. This relentless pursuit of absolute autonomy requires a biological collateral that is rarely discussed. To maintain the Dwayne Johnson global enterprise, his physical body has been transformed into an inescapable, highly demanding prison. At over 50 years old, he operates with the cardiovascular and joint strain of a man carrying 270 pounds of dense vascular muscle. The 4 a.m. workouts, heavily marketed to his audience as aspirational grind culture, represent a terrifying, unspoken reality. He is entirely trapped by his own aesthetic. He cannot afford to age naturally. He cannot afford to allow his muscle mass to deteriorate. The moment he physically resembles a normal aging mortal man, the foundational pillar of his billion-dollar action hero brand collapses. The boy who was ordered to smile in 1996 successfully defeated the corporate system, but in doing so, he was forced to construct an entirely new, infinitely more demanding machine. He became the CEO, the product, and the chief marketing officer of his own existence. Every public appearance, every social media post, and every contractual negotiation is heavily filtered through the absolute necessity of maintaining the illusion of total invulnerability. He won the war for his identity, but the victory required him to weaponize every single aspect of his humanity, Following the highly publicized structural turbulence of his Hollywood endeavors and the outright rejection of his executive maneuvers within the DC extended universe, Dwayne Johnson required a monumental recalibration of his global equity. The architectural blueprint for this recalibration did not lie within another conventional studio negotiation. It resided in a historic, unprecedented corporate merger. In late 2023, the wrestling monopoly that had originally manufactured, manipulated, and profited from his psychological distress was actively being acquired by Endeavor, merging with the Ultimate Fighting Championship to form a new multi-billion-dollar global sports and entertainment syndicate, TKO Group Holdings. Johnson identified a catastrophic vulnerability in the transitioning corporate structure and executed the most significant power play of his professional life. On January 23, 2024, he did not sign a standard performer's contract. He did not return to the wrestling industry as an independent contractor subject to the whims of a booking committee. He returned as an owner. He was officially appointed to the board of directors of TKO Group Holdings. Concurrently, he executed a ruthless legal maneuver that rectified the original sin committed against him in the Madison Square Garden locker room 28 years prior. He secured full, unencumbered intellectual property rights and legal trademark ownership of the name The Rock. The psychological and structural implications of this transaction are absolute. The corporation could no longer lease his identity, dictate his merchandise percentages, or threaten his historical legacy. He legally owned the avatar. The multi-billion-dollar conglomerate was now forced to negotiate with him for the privilege of utilizing the character they had originally tried to micromanage into oblivion. The power dynamic was permanently, irreversibly inverted. He had successfully infiltrated the executive boardroom of the very machine that once demanded his unquestioning submission. His subsequent return to global television programming was a masterclass in narrative and psychological dominance. He explicitly refused to resurrect the nostalgic catchphrase-shouting hero of the early 2000s. He completely discarded the heavily curated, universally beloved nice guy facade he utilized to sell tequila and family comedies. Instead, he engineered an entirely new, terrifyingly authentic persona, the final boss. This iteration was the absolute clinical antithesis of Rocky Mavia. Rejecting bright, marketing-friendly colors entirely, the final boss was draped in custom exorbitant silk shirts and designer sunglasses, projecting the cold, detached opulence of a corporate tyrant. He completely abandoned the mandated smile, replacing it with a permanent icy sneer. He utilized unrestricted aggressive profanity on live broadcasts, deliberately violating standard television network protocols with the brazen, untouchable impunity of a man who literally governed the corporation. He blurred the lines between scripted television antagonist and legitimate real-world executive power, weaponizing his boardroom status to psychologically terrorize other performers. He explicitly reminded the audience in the locker room that he was not a peer. He was their employer. The most profound element of this 2024 and ongoing 2026 run is his absolute reclamation and weaponization of his Polynesian bloodline. In 1996, the corporate executives viewed his Samoan heritage as a superficial, exotic marketing hook, stripping it of its inherent warrior ethos to present a sanitized, non-threatening caricature. Under his executive control as the final boss, The Anoa'i family tree was positioned as the absolute gravitational center of the entire TKO universe. He aligned himself with the Bloodline faction, effectively transforming his legitimate real-world family hierarchy into the most lucrative narrative property in the history of the industry. He no longer allowed his heritage to be a backdrop. He enforced it as corporate law. He demanded that the audience acknowledge the High Chief legacy, the exact lineage the company had previously attempted to suppress. He executed this enforcement with staggering visceral violence. The defining moment of this era occurred in a freezing rainstorm in Chicago, where Johnson orchestrated a brutal, seemingly unscripted assault on rival performer Cody Rhodes. He viciously beat the man with a leather weight belt, wiped the victim's blood onto the belt, and stared directly into the camera to deliver whispered, psychopathic threats to the victim's mother. It was an exhibition of raw, terrifying cruelty. This specific sequence was not merely a theatrical performance. It was a psychological exorcism. The man who was once ordered to suppress his aggression, who was forced to smile while enduring public humiliation, was now utilizing the corporation's global broadcast apparatus to project absolute, unchecked dominance. He did not ask the crowd for their approval. He did not care if they cheered or booed. He operated with the terrifying liberation of a man who cannot be fired, suspended, or reprimanded. He had effectively transformed the WWE television product into a real-time documentary of his own executive immunity. Navigating firmly into 2026, Johnson's unprecedented dual dominion over Hollywood and the TKO boardroom establishes a terrifying new metric for celebrity leverage. Operating completely above the traditional labor hierarchy, he now dictates the exact biological toll he is willing to absorb during stadium events, seamlessly pivoting back to his executive suites to orchestrate international media rights. Weaponizing his production banner, $7, he actively controls the very documentary lenses chronicling his in-ring return, permanently insulating his historical narrative from hostile corporate editing bays. The former independent contractor has successfully mutated into the absolute architect, product, distributor, and ultimate financial beneficiary. This trajectory exposes the clinical, uncompromising pathology of the modern entertainment complex, a machine fundamentally engineered to consume. The standard corporate blueprint relies entirely on extracting raw human charisma, sanitizing it into highly profitable commodities, and ruthlessly discarding the biological shell the moment profit margins contract. Maintaining this monopoly requires isolating the worker, weaponizing their financial desperation to enforce absolute compliance, and wielding the constant paralyzing threat of public obsolescence to guarantee submission. Standing as a profound statistical anomaly, Johnson survived this exact brutal extraction process. He outlasted the systemic attempts to erase his cultural identity, the orchestrated locker room subjugation, and the deafening roar of an arena actively demanding his demise. Recognizing that the corporate apparatus, whether operating from the wrestling headquarters of Connecticut or the studio lots of Los Angeles, functions with identical predatory instincts, he understood the fatal cost of subservience. The machine is programmed to perpetually demand a smile while silently siphoning an individual's intrinsic value until nothing remains. Therefore, the true suppressed history of his career completely bypasses any physical cassette locked in a corporate vault. It exists instead as a chilling psychological blueprint detailing his near destruction and subsequent hyper-aggressive reconstruction. It documents the exact anatomical shift of a human being pushed to the absolute brink by a conglomerate who consciously chose to violently dismantle the corporate hierarchy rather than allow himself to be broken. The culmination of this timeline permanently redefines the concept of legacy. Stripped of the transient adulation of a stadium crowd or the accumulation of scripted championships, his ultimate triumph rests purely in the uncompromising weaponization of self-ownership. Leveraging the very platform that initially attempted to commodify his existence, he engineered a personal empire of such massive, undeniable financial gravity that he explicitly purchased a seat inside the exact boardroom that once mandated his humiliation. Entering the system as a disposable piece of heavily sanitized corporate property, Dwayne Johnson emerged as the undisputed, untouchable master of his own universe.